I first heard the work of Margaret Bonds here in London at a live concert, and her song cycle, Songs of the Seasons, was being performed. Her music sounded like a completely new sound to me, even though she was born in 1913. The song was based from texts by the poet Langston Hughes, and the way she used the piano and voice, it felt like the text just leaping off the pages. It was such vivid word painting. The harmonies were so colourful, and the reason why the sound sounded so new to me within a classical context was her incorporation of jazz and Negro spirituals along with the romantic classical style. What's interesting about her was that she was literally born into a musical home. Her mother, called Estelle Bonds, was a professional pianist and organist and was very much at the centre of the Chicago Renaissance at the time. Now, that was a creative movement that was blossoming out of Chicago amongst the African American community. And what was special about it was that they were using the arts to promote the black identity and to promote the sense of racial pride. So Estelle used her home as a network for that community. She provided hospitality for all the great artists in that community and who were coming through Chicago to connect. So Margaret Bonds literally grew up around great African American musicians such as Florence Price, who was America's first African American female symphonist, such as Will Marion Cook, who was not just a composer but the student of Anton Dvorak and the founder of a jazz orchestra that went to perform for King George V in England. And so she had the most unusual upbringing. Her father also was very unusual. He was a black physician and also a civil rights activist, and he wrote this astonishing book about African American women and their biographies, which he published in, I think, 1893. And it was called Noted Women Negroes and Their Triumphs. And it was all about celebrating the stories and the lives of black women. So that was an unprecedented book for 1893 because people generally weren't celebrating women or black women, but this man was. And I think both influence of her mother and her father, although they divorced quite early in her life, is really like a strand through her childhood and her adult life and her music. Because like her parents, she championed the music of African Americans, but she also championed African American musicians and she championed women from all walks of life within their career. So I think the visitor that would have come through her mother's home with the biggest impact would have been Florence Price, because Florence Price became both her piano teacher and her composition teacher by the time Margaret Bonds was a teenager, around 13 years old. So as a composer under Price's leadership, Margaret Bonds grew incredibly quickly, but also the style of fusing Negro spirituals and jazz with classical music was undoubtedly handed down from Florence Price to Margaret Bonds, because Florence Price also wrote in that way. Although their music is unique and doesn't copy or resemble one another, there is that similarity and that value of incorporating African musical idioms with American folk or classical music. She was also a piano student of Florence Price, and she would have been an astonishing piano student to have, because Margaret Bonds actually was a child prodigy pianist. By the time that she was 17, she was already premiering bigger works that happened to be written by Florence Price, her teacher, at really prestigious events. Florence Price did become a lifelong friend of Margaret Bonds, but also Estelle Bonds, Margaret's mother. There was a period of time when Florence Price actually lived with Estelle Bonds and her daughter Margaret Bonds in the family home, and that was because Florence Price went through a divorce, and the close relationship she had with the Bonds family meant that she moved in with them for a time. So Florence Price is a composer whose values I love. She would incorporate in her classical music, as we know, Negro spirituals and jazz, and also African juba dances and African drum rhythms in her orchestral works. But not only that, she'd also incorporate American folk into her music. She saw music, or her music, as an opportunity to reflect the melting pot of the American nation. I love the way that she stood up for her own community, but she was embracing everyone else's racial identity as well. And she really strove to create a music for everybody. Now, I love the way that she particularly did that, but there were other people doing similar things, maybe for different reasons, before her too. We can go back to Will Marion Cook, who also was encouraged actually by his teacher Anton Dvorak to include African and African American music into his classical style, because Dvorak did the same thing with Czech music. So although we see the reason why people were doing that, kind of expanding and growing, we can see this tradition coming in from Europe and also the African American community to kind of take folk music and, Negro spirituals and to fuse it with their classical compositions. Bonds very much focused, I think, in comparison to Florence Price, more on Negro spirituals in her classical music. But this was something that was really handed down to her. Margaret Bonds arranged over 50 Negro spirituals in her list of work. And not just for piano, for orchestra, for chamber music. I mean, she really spent a lot of time bringing Negro spirituals into the classical repertoire. Bonds' education under Florence Price and the culture she had within her family home was incredibly affirming. She grew up believing that she didn't have limitations in achieving what she wanted to achieve, because her parents carefully kind of encouraged her and empowered her during her childhood. However, when she then crossed over to being a university student at Northwestern, the culture was entirely different. There, she describes herself as having met profound racism. That's what she says, profound racism. And she encountered limitations. She encountered the culture of its time, where she was able to attend lectures and able to attend classes, but not able to eat in the canteen with her counterparts, her white counterpart students. And she found it quite oppressive. She felt like people were putting up with her there. And she very much felt isolated and invisible. And it was a very difficult time for her, and I think it would have been quite a shock coming from the home that she grew up in, where her parents were very carefully trying to keep a lot of that out of her life so that they could see her blossom and develop in a really healthy way at home. However, although her student time at university was not a positive experience for her, there were things happening during her student years outside the university that were very positive. So I would say that her professional career actually began during her student years. So she was going to university and kind of made to feel limited and invisible there, but at the same time she was winning national prizes and on national and international stages and in national press with her piano playing and her composition in the professional world outside the university. So that's a huge contrast. The other thing that was a silver lining for her during her student years at Northwestern was her visit to the public library in the town. So not the university library, but the public library, where she went down into the poetry section, and it was there that she discovered the poetry of Langston Hughes, a great African-American poet, also the inventor of jazz poetry, an activist. And that's where she discovered the poem, The Negro Speaks Rivers, and it really touched her, and she felt as if that poem empowered her and brought a sense of dignity and empowerment back into her life, because that poem is all about bringing dignity to the black man through the amazing history that myself and the black people have. And yeah, she felt like, or she described it herself as a poem that saved her during her university years. What's really special about that story too is that later on in her life she met Langston Hughes, and he became a huge influence on her musical life and career. So I mentioned that during her university years, she was absolutely winning it in the professional circuit. And there was one particular event that really illustrates that, and that was her premiere of her teacher's composition, Florence Price's Piano Concerto in D minor, where she was the concerto soloist for that, and she premiered that at the Chicago World Fair. And it was such a prestigious event. It was such a big deal. She was premiering it because Florence Price won a prize for it. Florence Price also wrote it for Margaret Bonds, dedicated to her. She describes her as my talented friend, Margaret Bonds. And, you know, all the press are there, but also so many formidable and important leading musicians are there. For example, even George Gershwin himself was in the audience. So it was huge exposure for her. It was very successful. It wasn't the only time that she played at the World Fair. She had also played at the World Fair with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, making history as the first black concerto soloist ever to play with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And she was still a teenager when she did that, because she started Northwestern at 16 years old. So I just find the contrast extraordinary, that she could go into school every day and feel small. And then maybe at the weekend she'd be doing something like this, you know, on a world stage. Because the World Fair in 1933, 1934 in Chicago was seen historically, or later he's seen historically, as one of the most important fairs of the 20th century. And it was also seen as kind of beacon of hope through the Great Depression. So it's extraordinary that she made 2 appearances as a teenager. So before her premiere and debuting at the World Fair, she had also premiered a brilliant meaty solo piano piece by her teacher Florence Price called Fantasy Negra No. 1 at the National Association of Negro Musicians, and that had captured the attention of the black press, and again had kind of introduced her to the public on a national scale. Margaret Bonds did study at Juilliard, and she studied with some pretty eminent professors at the time. So she was under Roy Harris, Robert Starer, Emerson Harper, and she also studied piano with Diane Hertz and Walter Gossett. My understanding is that she didn't actually study with Nadia Boulanger, but that she aspired to study with her, and definitely requested and reached out to Boulanger. My understanding is that Boulanger inspected her compositional work, particularly The Negro Speaks Rivers, which was a prize-winning composition by them, and basically said that Margaret Bonds had no further need of being taught, and that she refused to teach her. Now, some people interpret that as a rejection and a situation of racism. I don't think so, because Nadia Boulanger also taught Julia Perry and really championed Julia Perry. So, I mean, who knows? But I just don't think it was racism. I think it may well have been a compliment and a kind of way of saying, go girl, you're professional, you don't need to, you have your own style, you have your own skill, you don't need to be under a teacher anymore. When did Margaret Bonds decide to embark upon a professional career? I think for people like her, and for many prodigies and people that you would describe as creative geniuses, I think it's very hard to define that moment. But I think for a lot of them, they kind of just are, and as children, they start to encounter large public stages, and as teenagers, or sometimes even younger as children, they start to encounter national and international stages. I mean, let's take a huge genius. When did Yehudi Menuhin decide to become a professional violinist? For example, when would Yehudi Menuhin have decided to become a professional violinist? It's probably just like a state of being that morphed into stuff because the demand on his gift is so worldwide. And my feeling about Margaret Bonds is that she had this huge gift and there's a draw in it, and things just became organic professionally when she was young. However, that's not to say that she didn't work very hard at her craft. She did. She was clearly totally passionate about what she did. And I think even though her professional career took off before she moved to New York and while she was a student, I think her move to New York can be seen as a more of a defining point of her choosing to make conscious decisions about her career. So she moved to New York, to Harlem particularly, at a time when the Harlem Renaissance was in full swing, and there were more opportunities for black musicians in Harlem than Chicago, although there was a creative movement going on in both places. I think going back to her conscious choice to move there, also for career decisions, she also moved there after she had tried to set up a music school in Chicago and it had failed. So that kind of indicates that she's not giving up, but she's trying again in a different arena, She didn't go to New York to set up a school, although she did set up lots of education projects in schools eventually in her life. But she had more career opportunities there. She also studied at Juilliard, and by that time she'd met Langston Hughes, the poet that she describes as saving her. And he was in Harlem, and in fact, of course he was in Harlem. He was a significant artist that was part of the Harlem Renaissance, a significant figurehead. But anyway, he really encouraged her to move to New York. He thought it'd be good for her career and for her artistic development. And once she did that, he really went out of his way, to introduce her to his circle of colleagues and friends, and set her up with opportunities. So I guess he thought that she would have better soil for herself in Harlem, and kind of set her up with connections and opportunities for that to grow there, and it did. One of the reasons why things grew so well in New York was also her collaboration with Langston Hughes. So she absolutely adored him. They were friends until his death, but they also collaborated together, and she wrote so many song cycles and art songs and compositions based on text by Langston Hughes, and theatre. And, that collaboration was totally focal to her work. And when I think about characteristics and key features of the music of Margaret Bonds, obviously the Negro spirituals is one, and her virtuosity on the piano, but a big one is her collaboration with Langston Hughes. So in 1963, Bonds went with Eugene Bryce, the singer, to Alabama to tour, and she had an experience that changed her life, and it feels like everything in her life was in her music, so it impacted her music too. So they visited Montgomery, Alabama, where 8 years earlier, of course, Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat for a white passenger, which sparked the Montgomery bus boycotts, of course led by Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, the year of Bonds' trip to Alabama, the Ku Klux Klan also bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And that church, of course, had been a key meeting place for the civil rights movement. It was attacked on a Sunday morning at a time of worship and claimed the lives of 4 innocent African American girls, plus injuring people outside the church. Dr. King said about the incident that it was one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. And Bonds responded to both the Montgomery bus boycott, both Dr. King's response and the Birmingham firebombing in one major orchestral work, and that was the 7-movement symphonic work that she wrote called the Montgomery Variations. So in this work, she also uses a Negro spiritual, and the spiritual that she uses is "I Want Jesus to Walk With Me." Unfortunately, Bonds actually never heard the work being performed or rehearsed. It's a wonderful work, and it was premiered for the first time after her death by Zubin Mehta, played by the LA Phil, and at the Hollywood Super Bowl. She dedicated it to Martin Luther King, and really it's a set of 7 variations. And the first variation has a title called Decision, under which Bonds pens this. Under the leadership of Martin Luther King, the SCLC Negroes in Montgomery decided to boycott the bus company and to fight for their rights as citizens. Then variation 6 is titled One Sunday in the South, and variation 7 is called Lament and describes the events of the Birmingham firebombing. So I've incorporated Troubled Water in my 2024 EP release called Black and Classical, standing alongside works by Florence Price and Betty Jackson King. I was inspired to record this piece because I am someone who's always on the lookout for classical music that is being done in either a new way or a different way, or I will create a new piece of classical music or a new program that's been done in a new way or a different way. That's what inspires me. And I also like, particularly in my live concerts, to create wide access for people. So people who don't normally come to listen to classical music, I like to include music that they feel they can connect with from other genres, or break it down in such a way that they can access it. And Margaret Bonds' music, particularly Troubled Waters, does this so well. It sounds great on the release because it makes the release really original to have this hybrid of sound. And obviously in touring, doing live touring from that release, it works so well in the concert hall. When I have done Black and Classical live concerts, I immediately saw and met an increase of people coming into my concerts who don't normally go to classical concerts or don't normally go to the classical concert hall, and they loved it. They were having a great time. There was an increase of people, Black British people, coming to my classical concerts who said, we don't normally listen to this music, but we know Wade in the Water, like we know what that's about, and where they just felt really just thrilled that something that is so important to our culture was being represented on the stage in the classical concert hall too. It was great. I saw an increase of children coming to my concerts because parents felt it was really important to bring their children to hear this music, and not just the music, but me talk about its history. And as a result, I think just a wider audience have bought or are streaming the EP. Margaret Bonds is also one of my heroes, because she just wouldn't be put in the box. We talked about how she incorporated Negro spirituals with classical music and jazz, but, she also wrote jazz for Glenn Miller's orchestra. She also wrote pop arrangements for Eartha Kitt. I mean, how cool is that? It's absolutely amazing. And I think, many of us wouldn't have been alive before. Some of us would have been, but not all of us would have been alive before Margaret Bonds died. But Eartha Kitt kind of bridges a gap between, you know, what we know, what we see, like film-wise and music-wise in our generation, and Margaret Bonds. So it's like very relatable. She's a very relatable bridge between then and now. And, you know, she also composed for film. She worked in film studios as a composer and a music consultant. And what I like about her is because she really honed her craft to being an excellent composer and an excellent concert pianist, and saw that she could transfer it to all kinds of music, and did. And she did all these different things: writing jingles, writing film music, writing theatre music, writing pop arrangements, but all the time also writing art songs and song cycles and large-scale orchestral works. So she just wouldn't be confined. And that's someone that I really, really respect. And, you know, I try my best every day to hone my classical art, and I'm very obsessive with my piano technique. I'm very obsessive about the sound that I create when I'm composing on my scores. But I also work with jazz artists, you know. I also work with pop artists, and I absolutely love it. And I tend to work with jazz artists or pop artists who want to work with the classical artists, you know, because they're kind of got the same hat on, where they don't see the borders, and they're not confined by boxes either. They just hear music. I've always been a great believer in people being inspired in the concert hall. That's something that my dad spoke to me about when I was a child. He said, when you write, make sure you also write for people who haven't had the musical education that you've had. He said, you used to say, you know, you've been schooled and you've been educated in classical music, but make sure that you also use it for people who haven't, for them to catch inspiration and to hear something that they can connect with easily, and don't have to have gone through lots of formal music education to understand. And Margaret Bonds does that, you know. She does it brilliantly. And it's interesting how relevant her music is today. You know, music that was being written in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's so relevant in 2025 because black stories still need to be told. And her music is a black story, telling black stories. Margaret Bonds has to occupy a place in the pantheon of great American music. She has to. Not just because of her skill and her gifting, and the amount of works that she wrote, not just because she wrote small miniature solos and art songs and song cycles, but also because she wrote great orchestral works. She has the broad spectrum that composers of the great traditional lineage have. But the reason why she absolutely belongs there is because if we can say that George Gershwin belongs there because of the way that he fused jazz with classical, and that is a reflection of the American sound. If we can say that about Gershwin, if we can say that about Copeland, that Copeland's incorporation of cowboy folk songs with classical music is a reflection of the American sound, and absolutely is, then for sure Margaret Bonds' incorporation of Negro spirituals and jazz with classical music also is a reflection of the American sound, and also sounds incredibly American sounding, doesn't it? But also her music historically is also a reflection of key historical moments in American history. She lived through times of change and turbulence. Bad turbulence, good change, positive and negative. But she was responding to it in real time, that are now keys for us or milestones in American history. You know, a composer who responds to the Montgomery Montgomery bus boycott, and a composer who responds to the Birmingham fire bombings. Yeah, her works are part of the American history and of the American people. I'm looking forward to touring in America from 2027. At the moment, we've got Florida and Texas in the diary. Some more to follow, I hope. And I'll be playing one of my live concerts called The American Piano, which actually includes music by Florence Price, Margaret Bonds, and Betty Jackson King, but also includes music by George Gershwin, by Aaron Copland, by Lola Perrin, who is an American minimalist composer living in France and also a climate activist, by Connor Chi, who is an amazing First Nations composer, 33 years old. I play his pieces in the concert program, but I also like to use them as encores, and they're stunning encores. So the idea behind that is to promote American music from not all, but from different American cultural idioms.